Today on BIOS Ventures, we're absolutely thrilled to welcome Ameena El-Bibany, partner at ARTIS Ventures, to the show. Ameena, thank you once again for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Let's kick things off. Ameena, would you mind sharing a brief personal introduction with us?
Yeah, so I actually was previously a scientist in my last lifetime. My background is in genetics. I originally spent quite a bit of time in my early career doing R&D across academic settings, areas like stem cell engineering, microbiome work, DNA damage and repair, and then spent as well a bit of time on the industry side at Novozymes working on, I guess what's now called synthetic biology, but some synbio approaches there to improve some of the industrial scale-up yields that they had. I then got into venture almost a decade ago now in 2014. I spent the first 5 years or so at another early stage firm where I came in to start and build out the health and bio practice there. Was the only healthcare investor, on the team. The rest of the team was focused on, traditional tech spaces, but scaled it to about a third of the firm's investments overall. I carved into the bio space, and ARTIS, who was one of my co-investors over those years, started getting to know them and work with them, and joined the firm here back in 2019.
And we're excited to dive a little bit deeper into all of that. But before we do, could you provide a brief introduction to ARTIS for us as well? Maybe set the stage for the broader conversation.
Yeah, so we're an early stage firm based in San Francisco, really focused on the realm of tech bio, which is a term that actually my colleagues coined. It's exciting that that term is almost ubiquitous now. It's pretty commonplace, and so it's not one that I often have to define anymore for people who are in the realm. But for the ones who aren't, it is essentially the reverse of traditional biotech, where many things historically were very discovery focused. And as well single asset, type companies, which ultimately led to a lot of, binary outcomes, especially in therapeutics. A drug either works or it doesn't work. Tech bio is really more of a tech and engineering first approach to this space. And so by applying engineering principles, we believe that we can build platforms that both shorten iteration cycles and the time it takes to get therapeutics to market, but also provide more of a diversification strategy through these platforms. So fewer binary outcomes means higher likelihood of success and getting to diversify both within each company and also on a fund and portfolio level.
As tech bio investors ourselves, absolutely love that description and to be working with you to help evangelize and bring the space forward. So thank you for those wonderful introductions of yourself and of the firm. I'd love to dive deeper into the journey you already started to highlight. And so while you have more than a decade of experience in healthcare, you started in stem cell R&D right out of undergrad, and then rapidly advanced your career into venture capital. Maybe starting right from the beginning, what led you to study genetics and academic research at Davis? Why biology for you?
Yeah, I mean, so this is a cliche, but very genuine answer. I remember actually the first, life sciences class I ever took, seventh grade. I think I was 12 at the time. And we had a unit on genetics, and they taught us kind of the foundational basics of Punnett squares, which is a very simplified place to start. But part of why I just got so enamored with it is I think I was always fascinated with, people in the world around me, what makes us similar, what sets us apart. And so genetics really just became another lens to look through and another tool to kind of understand the world around me. From there, took every bio class I could get my hands on. And, fortunately, I was able to pursue a number of research opportunities, even as an undergrad and beyond, but got to work on some, really cool NSF funded projects, even publish some of my work very early in my career. And so the more I learn about genetics and, kind of biology and life sciences as a whole, the more I realize that there's still so much more to learn. And so I think from that sense, it's a really, intellectually satisfying and gratifying field.
And that's where, as you said earlier, technology can come in to help accelerate that biological insight generation. And so, as you mentioned, you pursued that bachelor's in genetics and continued to advance your research work in full-time roles at UC Davis before you joined Rising Tide VC, where you pretty quickly advanced to becoming a partner. Can you tell us more about what led you to transition from the bench to VC? And in that process, why Rising Tide?
Yeah, so I mean, honestly, I never planned to be in VC. My original plan was to pursue a PhD, and prior to getting to do so, I got swept into this world. Rising Tide was a group that had never made a healthcare investment prior to my joining. They, didn't have anyone on the team with that right technical background to assess companies. And so the idea was actually just to spend a year there, help them with some technical due diligence, and then go into a PhD. And knowing that I didn't want to stay in academia forever, some of the learning for me was to start understanding how science can be commercialized, before kind of figuring out what I wanted to go really deep in, during my PhD. But during my time at the firm, I began, on some university campuses working with academic spinouts. And one of the kind of namely and formative experiences here was actually up at UBC in Vancouver, where I spent time, building relationships with different PIs, getting familiar with their research, what sort of, aspects of the research could be spin out into companies. And we ended up looking at a lot of opportunities. There were, 3 that were very compelling, out of that campus that we ended up identifying. One, Precision NanoSystems, which was actually my very first investment ever in VC, which ultimately got acquired by Danaher last year. Another was Biosystems, still active, but excited. They recently announced a $2.6 billion deal with Novo Nordisk. So super excited to see their growth there. And then the third was actually Upcellera, which I think is a big name these days. It's one that I tried to invest in, unfortunately couldn't for reasons and kind of, decision making, factors outside of my control early on in my career. But, company is now public and doing very well. So just got to see, some really interesting kind of, plays across the space and see that ecosystem evolve quite a bit as well. And felt that I was really playing a hand there. But to bring it back to the transition from, scientist to VC, I think there were, a few kind of things that I was able to glean early on. One, still getting to spend my time, with PIs, PhDs, postdocs at the early stages, which for me, having, come from the scientific field, still, satiated that need, that kind of scientific curiosity. So was still getting to learn a lot from all these brilliant folks. The second learning was, just starting to see really the huge gap that still existed between academia and industry, where a lot of companies fail. A lot of brilliant technology gets published and kind of put on the shelf. And so really started seeing the need for more effort to kind of bridge that gap between the two worlds. And lastly, actually just seeing the tangible impact that some of these companies were starting to have when they did reach the market, and realizing that we could kind of replicate this model, across different universities and institutions, just cemented for me that I was on the right path that I needed to be on, and my purpose kind of felt very aligned in that sense.
It makes a lot of sense, especially given the track record you're talking about from the earliest stages and exploring at that early point of translation. It sounds honestly like so much fun. And as you described, you're at Rising Tide VC, and given they weren't in the space before, you effectively founded, built, and led their health and bio investment practice. And so how do you think about some of maybe those major challenges and gaps in healthcare offerings that led you to really dive deeper into the space?
Yeah, well, I think, given my experience having done research, I saw so much, how much time it takes to not just run a single experiment, but how much time it takes to replicate those experiments across different samples. In the case of, stem cell engineering, for example, you're working on those cell schedules, not the other way around. So if that means, weekends in the lab, midnights at the lab when you need to be kind of culturing and passaging, then, so be it. And I wish that was the case just for me, but it's actually something that, scientists kind of all across the board have to deal with, from small academic labs all the way through to, the pharma companies that are developing kind of the next generation of drugs. And ultimately, I think some of the challenge there is that, smart minds should be focused on thinking about the right problems and thinking creatively how to push science forward, not necessarily so busy, repeating experiments, for the 100th or for the 1000th time, that it's a little bit of a waste of talent and knowledge. And so I started thinking about how some of these experiments and processes, could be accelerated or automated. Started identifying companies that were using, some interesting, like robust and established technology and engineering principles, whether it's, things like microfluidics, 3D printing, semiconductor, technology, and how they were using that to kind of automate, some of these workflow processes, whether it was, areas like LNP manufacturing for better drug delivery, or 3D printing for, human tissues for better, drug modeling and preclinical testing. And that's to say there's many other areas of healthcare that have a lot of gaps, but that was one of the first areas I began focusing on.
And as you think about that focus and maybe even take a step back, could you tell us maybe what it was like pitching the build of the health and bio practice to the Rising Tide management team? Were they really on board from the beginning, or was this something that you were brought in to do?
Yeah, so fortunately, there was a lot of alignment around, health and bio, just having huge needs in this space and the potential for impact that we thought we could do there. When I initially joined the firm, the business was investing through SPVs primarily, just on a deal-by-deal basis. And so, within the first couple of years I was there, was able to help launch the firm's first two pooled funds, which really helped streamline and accelerate our investment process, and helped us kind of be able to scale the level of breadth and depth that I could really go to in the health and bio space. And then from there, it was very much an exercise of working within the ecosystem and building kind of our singular reputation, but also the firm's reputation, almost from scratch, since we hadn't really had this work done before. And so spent a lot of time, in deal flow ecosystems, building brand reputation, a lot of time with co-investors across the ecosystem to collaborate and on deals. Healthcare especially is one where it takes a village to get companies kind of over the finish line. So, working with others is really paramount here. And over time, kind of beginning to, build interesting theses around different spaces as I was learning more and more around various white spaces.
And as we think about that, you spent about 5 years, many notable deals done. From that, you joined ARTIS in late 2019, just really before the pandemic. And so, having established such a strong name for yourself in the biotech investing space, especially in tech bio, among potential venture firms, what prompted you to join ARTIS?
Yeah, so I've mentioned over the years, I was fortunate to co-invest with a lot of great firms across the space. ARTIS was one of them. And so I had a great relationship with the team over the years, saw a lot of alignment in terms of where we were investing, what we were excited about, and some of our theses. Beyond that, I think what really stood out to me was the depth of the pharma relationships that the firm has. So ARTIS has a really deep bench of advisors. We call them pioneers, actually. These are C-suite and former C-suite folks across pharma, biotech, regulatory, the payer side as well, who are essentially extensions to our team, but they go much beyond just, kind of names and faces on the website. They don't just give us feedback on companies we're looking to invest in to help us assess, market fit there. But once we do make those investments, they actually roll up their sleeves and help quite a bit. So some of them come on as advisors to companies, some come on as independent board members, even, and really just kind of like focus on helping to accelerate the business there. And I think as we've seen more and more firms kind of come into the tech bio space more recently, and just beginning to start building their relationships there, I think the network that ARTIS had already built and been operating in for more than a decade just, really stood out.
And that is an absolutely strong and pioneering advantage. And so, as ARTIS itself, as the firm's goal is to make investments at the intersection of life sciences and technology, it's really a perfect description that, as you mentioned, has been very rapidly adopted by our peers and founders alike lately. And as far as I understand, you've used your foundational learnings in surgical robotics, synthetic biology, and beyond to expand ARTIS's aperture and appetite for such investments yourself, working with that group of advisors. And so, given the breadth of your experiences, and you touched on this briefly before, we'd just love to learn more about how you think about and develop your investment theses.
Yeah, so as I think about developing theses, there are a couple of things that I try to do and a couple of questions that I try to answer. So the first is, what is the edge of innovation within a space? And really here, I think there's no better way to learn about a space than from those, operating and innovating within it. Founders, if they've been building companies, in line with their experience, they know exactly where that edge of innovation is. I also spend quite a bit of time with, our industry partners, understanding kind of what the limitations of their current capabilities and technologies are. The second question I try to answer is, what are the problems that still exist at that edge? And I'd say it really takes time to build both a deep and unique perspective here on what the key problems are really holding a space back. Every person you speak to will highlight their perspective, but not without bias. And so here I focus on volume and just building a diverse enough picture that I can then see the problem from more of a holistic view and from, kind of every angle, and really try to coalesce on what are maybe the obvious kind of problems in the space that everyone is kind of agreeing on, but what are also maybe the non-obvious, challenges or bottlenecks that are still holding the space back. From there, it's really just pattern matching and hunting. As I talk to companies, I ask myself whether what they built actually solves all of these key problems that I've kind of coalesced on, or whether what they're building is only a partial solution. And I will say, I don't always know what the right answer or solution or technology is to build in each space, but I have found that once I've built a really keen sense of what I feel like are kind of the key bottlenecks here, then when I do see that solution, it's easier to recognize, and sometimes it just clicks and the light bulb goes off.
It's always an interesting question as an investor, right? Obviously, we try to be forward-looking, think about a space, and come up with an investment thesis. But at the same time, I always like to think founders are considerably smarter than we are. And so when they come to us with something entirely novel, being informed as much as we can is great, but simultaneously letting them lead us to where maybe the space can go is also exciting. So it always feels like there's that balance. At
Yeah.
least maybe to me. But as we think about maybe some of these investment theses, and as we think about areas you're interested in, you touched on a few of them earlier. Would love to learn more about the subsectors of tech bio you're currently most interested in exploring at the moment.
Yeah, so our team spans a lot of different spaces. We do everything from, pharma and, drug discovery and development, to provider and clinic facing investments, to even approaches outside of human health altogether, whether it's, food tech and industrial bio and beyond that as well. Given my background and my time spent on Novozymes, I'll mention just one, but a lot of different areas that I'm excited about. But, synthetic biology is one that I am very bullish on and excited about the potential it has. And I think it's a space where we're really just starting to scratch the surface of what some of these, systems are really capable of. Full stack systems that are capable of not just engineering factors, but running, functional assays at incredibly high throughputs, overlaying that with, predictive models that kind of tell you where to go in terms of engineering, as opposed to a trial and error. And I think these approaches will really unlock a lot of sectors at speeds we've never really seen before, whether that's areas like industrial chemicals, food development, oil and gas, or more sustainable approaches to energy. And that's in addition to how synthetic biology can even impact, healthcare applications and drug development. And so it's one that, truly the potential to, touch across and transform almost every sector is really an exciting one. And I think it's just about, understanding what are the right business models to be structuring and to the right strategies to be structuring in each sector, such that becomes kind of a sustainable future, 10 years from now, 20 years from now.
And that's the perfect transition, because historically, the philosophy of investment in tech bio has been pretty different from traditional biotech. And yet, in recent years, it almost feels like we're starting to see a melding of those two models, where technology and biology are developing or coming together to create those tech bio platforms, where the platform, as you described earlier, is really the most powerful asset. And so, do you feel like such innovation often works in parallel, or maybe sometimes ahead of traditional bioinnovation? Is the key value proposition in the technology as a facilitator of the biology, or in the long-term direct therapeutic and interventional products, or industrial chemicals and ag tech?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I'm really glad you're answering this or asking this because I think a lot of folks do think it's an either or at least as they position their kind of public narratives, it's often an either or. It's really both from my view. And I think the either or perspective on it, does come with it some dangers. I mean, for example, let's take therapeutic development as a space. At the end of the day, the business model that pharma recognizes here is an asset-based one. The drugs have to work. So we've attempted to build drugs historically the old way, which was, discovery-based, kind of trial and error. And that's been most of the history of drug development. And so I think we're all kind of keenly aware of how challenging that's become with the time it takes to get a drug across the finish line and the amount of funding that needs to go to develop it. On the flip side, when it comes to technology, and let's take, for example, AI for drug discovery platforms, you could pour hundreds of millions of dollars into a platform. And at the end of the day, if it doesn't discover or develop better drugs, it won't matter. And so the two are very kind of intimately linked. And so I try to always answer, this question of how does the technical platform actually lead to a better asset? Is it, for example, enabling a novel mechanism of action that, improves efficacy? Is it employing, better targeting or delivery to reduce toxicity? There has to be a really clear answer on the why the platform is delivering a better asset. And if you look at the space on a whole, and I won't kind of name names, but there are a lot of very large companies out there that have been hugely capitalized and are more kind of these tech and platform companies. And you look at their pipelines and you see some of their lead assets are often in-licensed. And so I think there's still this gap of what value the tech platform actually, translates to an asset, and that gap needs to be converged a little bit more. Maybe the succinct way of actually rephrasing, all of this is, more shots on goal don't actually increase the chance of success if those shots aren't better aimed at the goal. And I think that's just been my approach to the balance of, platform versus assets.
And as we think about that, you and the ARTIS team have made some really incredible investments into companies such as Active Surgical, Range Bio, Glyphic, Outpace, and many more. So maybe using these companies as examples, maybe not. As we think about that separation process and understand how that technology can come together with the biology, can you share maybe more about what you look for as part of the diligence process at ARTIS? How are you separating the signal from the noise when you evaluate companies?
Yeah, there's a few things I'm trying to answer when I am assessing companies. First and foremost, and especially because we invest quite early stages, who is the team and why are they the right people to be, tackling this problem? What of their experience kind of gives them an interesting edge? And really, we're asking this on a global scale. So, are these the right people in the entire world to be tackling this problem? The second is, what is the problem and how big is it? And I'd say this goes beyond just looking at, market sizing and estimating the numbers there, but how well has the team actually characterized the problem by, speaking to the right end users, knowing which limitations still exist. Sometimes we see interesting technologies that get developed and then are out searching for a problem to solve. But I often encourage founders to actually think about it from the other way around, of start with a problem, characterize it to the best of your ability, and that way you can build the exact right solution needed to fix it. And I think that's often what drives kind of the difference between a nice to have and a need to have product at the end of the day. Third thing is, often, what's the unique edge? Usually in tech bio, this is, something to do with the technology or the science. So, how does that perform better than others in the space? What is the strategy to protect it and maintain those barriers to entry? And then how do they also think about, continuous learning and iteration to kind of create feedback loops to keep them ahead of others? The fourth is more commercial. So who's excited to adopt this? Not that we expect companies to be revenue generating when we do invest, but in other words, do we have confidence that they will reach product market fit? So what's the team's understanding of all the stakeholders involved in the purchasing or adoption process? Have they structured the right business model to succeed in that space? And here we also lean on one of our superpowers, our pioneer network in our due diligence. So these folks give us feedback on the companies we're taking a look at and help us validate some of the market fit there as well. The last point is actually a question that we ask ourselves as opposed to the management team. But how can we actually be of value to the business? We view ourselves as long-term partners to these founders that we invest in. And so we want to make sure that we're bringing value to that partnership as well beyond just, capital. So we try to answer that question for ourselves. Sometimes it's things like rolling up our sleeves to, help with development strategy, identifying, gaps in data, helping recruit key additions to the team. And then in addition to us, our pioneers who also roll up their sleeves and, help with anything from, mentorship to advising to, joining as board members and helping to accelerate some of the businesses from that perspective.
It's always, it feels like team market tech. And it sounds like, especially with the pioneers you have to advise and support the founders, a great way of exploring and reaching out and assessing. So as we think then about the companies you're potentially investing in, do you have any recommendations for founders who might want to reach out to you at ARTIS or the team broadly?
Yeah, I'd say, a warm intro from someone trusted within our network is always the strongest. That said, there are a lot of ways to get in touch and, get a warm intro to our team, whether it's through our, existing portfolio founders, whether it's through, co-investors in the space, whether it's through our fellows who, are folks who are in their MD, PhDs and postdocs across different academic groups and institutions across the world who spend a year with us to learn what venture is and how it works. And we are also looking at, always expanding our networks into interesting areas and kind of, continuing to increase access in the number of ways that folks can get in touch with us. And lastly, I think, sometimes just even a cold email, if it's, thoughtful and personalized, I think I always recommend, folks to do that if needed as well. And I think something that is thoughtful can also kind of get through the door and get our attention as well.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it sounds silly to say sometimes, but I feel like a founder demonstrating that hustle to be thoughtful, to get that warm intro is in many ways one of the greatest demonstrations that they're going to be able to succeed with a startup, especially from the early stages when there is so much. You just make it happen, as silly as that might sound. So maybe pivoting slightly, obviously you have a great reputation as a founder first investor, and so would love to ask, what does being a good investment partner to your portfolio companies mean at ARTIS? And you've answered this a bit, but tackling and diving in on it directly.
Yeah, well, thank you. I think at the end of the day, being a good partner really just means sitting on the same side of the table as your founders and, helping bring their vision to life and doing whatever it takes, to get there. That means having a relationship with these founders that goes much beyond, the boardroom where they can call or text any time of, day or night. It means also for myself, I feel that asking the right thoughtful questions is very important in my role as an investor. And that's in order to either, push back on an assumption that a founder, has maybe made, bring light to a new perspective that maybe they haven't considered, and really just kind of, open up new lenses or new perspectives on what they should be considering to kind of get to that holistic picture. And I think ultimately, this is a little bit more of kind of like a philosophical or cultural, perspective to the question. At the end of the day, I don't think that companies, work for their investors or work for their board. It's actually the other way around. Investors and boards work for the companies. And so really, whatever it is that's, and it's always going to be tailored from company to company, but whatever it is that is needed, to accelerate or help, fill gaps is honestly what I think a good investor, should be willing to do.
Well said. And double clicking on that a little bit, especially as we talk about supporting people and organizations. You've talked about the pioneering network and would love to dive in there in a moment. But as we think about almost the lengthy life cycle of these life sciences and healthcare companies, building teams, building company culture, especially with intentionality, it can be really critical, especially in the early stages. And so,
Mhm.
background across academia, startup, VC, how do you think about supporting, especially interdisciplinary teams in tech bio and helping those founders build and support a long-lasting company culture?
Well, I'll say it's never too early to be thinking about culture when you're building a company, or even if you're building a VC firm, because it will inform, every decision across the business. Things like strategy, things like the type of people you want to recruit, how well you can even retain your talent. And a mistake that I often see is that companies sometimes think about it too late once the team is too big. And it's always easier to build a culture than it is to correct one, in retrospect. When it comes to interdisciplinary teams, I'll actually talk about kind of a nuanced term here that I learned from, one of my investments, Inceptive, that I love. It's anti-disciplinary science, not anti as in, ANTI, meaning, opposite or against, but anti-ANTE, meaning before. Science historically has been kind of, fractioned and organized into disciplines, which I think in one sense, organization helps kind of understanding and depth, but I think in another sense also led to a lot of silos in knowledge. Interdisciplinary science was a new wave that kind of acknowledged that, continued innovation required that we converge these silo disciplines and start working across them. But I think the next wave of innovation will require anti-disciplinary science, meaning the science that precedes the organization of new disciplines. And I think in order to turn science and the way we've always developed it on its head, building technology in these unexplored frontiers will require building teams and recruiting talent that gravitate towards more of an anti-disciplinary mindset. And ultimately, those are going to be the people that are shaping the disciplines of tomorrow that we can't even imagine today.
Oh, I love that term, and please thank your founders for for me for having shared it through.
Yeah.
Taking maybe this in a slightly different direction, but staying on that same broader topic. Um, and as a heads up, this is a question I'm sort of just asking on the fly. So if you don't want to answer it, let me know. But it feels like a point, and rightly, of particular focus and importance today is as we think about building company cultures, including diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of that process among founders, boards, and teams. And so, given you see and support companies from the earliest stages, and you really do dive in and get involved, do you have any thoughts on how we as VCs can provide support to founders seeking to better incorporate DE and I into team building?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm actually very proud to be part of a firm where our portfolio is very diverse in terms of the founders that are starting these companies. And so I'm fortunate that this is something that's important to my entire firm today. DEI is so important, and I'm speaking as someone who comes from a minority background. And I think it's really on both companies and investors to be thinking thoughtfully around how to expand the lens of, perspectives and, minds around the table to kind of bolster and build the best companies. I think, people from different backgrounds bring interesting perspective, come from all walks of life, bring up different risks. And I think ultimately that makes everything stronger. So definitely, DEI is something that we think about, as we're talking to founders and thinking or hearing more about how they think about building their cultures. That's one thing that we love to hear them, talk about and think about and be proactive about at the earliest stages. I think also, rewinding that to how we get more people into STEM fields is also something that I've focused on quite a bit over my career. I mean, I mentioned I fell in love with genetics when I was 12, and at that young age had a fantastic teacher that taught me about it, that created for me just a very positive environment where it was approachable. It was I could ask any question without kind of fearing what is a stupid question or anything. So I think creating positive experiences for, people at young ages from, whether it's girls or people from, diverse or minority backgrounds, how we kind of build that foundation, help them fall in love with STEM fields such that, they continue to kind of, pursue and build their careers off of that is something that's, incredibly important to me.
And it's a goal I think we should all be working towards. And so as we think maybe more broadly to something you've mentioned from the beginning is one of ARTIS's superpowers as a firm, it's the Pioneer Network.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just wanted to give you a chance, you've touched on it a lot, but maybe just to call it out specifically, give you a chance to highlight them and how they not only work with the team, but maybe how they're selected and chosen, who gets involved, and how you think about the Pioneer Network moving forward.
Yeah, so this is a group of individuals that, members of my team, we've been working with them for more than a decade. So these relationships run deep. These are folks that we can, email, call, text anytime. So when I say extensions to our team, I really do mean that, especially since our core team is so small. They're really integral here. But these are, as we've looked at spaces and map out where we want to invest. I mean, these are execs and, former execs from pharma, biotech, regulatory, the payer side, also academic institutions and kind of leading areas of research and technology. And we're frankly very blessed that they, spend their time with us and with our companies, helping to fill gaps, helping to accelerate, whether, it's advisoring, mentoring, joining boards. And we also, once a year, we actually do a retreat with, our pharma partners, bring our portfolio companies, and it's 2 days of just like really in depth, mapping out spaces, answering a lot of, key unanswered questions in the space. So really getting to learn from them and, getting their mind share has just been a huge, addition to our group. And so we're very lucky to have this program in place.
It sounds like they're absolutely, as you said, that great extension that everyone hopes for when, especially we're looking across so many diverse areas, having that experience is great. And so as we think about that diversity, from the beginning of your time with Rising Tide and now with ARTIS, you've had a very future forward and obviously tech-enabled investing perspective. And so what have you been seeing recently from founders that you're most excited by in the next cycle of emerging technologies?
So there are a lot of different spaces I'm excited about today, but one I'll touch on is the realm of proteomics, because there's still really so much unmapped in this space. We've come a long way in genomics, but for the most part, the majority of your genome will kind of stay the same throughout your life. Caveats here being, epigenetic changes or mutations that occur in your life that might lead to cancer or other diseases. But for the most part, it doesn't change too much. The proteome, on the other hand, is constantly changing, whether based on specific cell type, differentiation stage, environmental factors, age, drugs, like countless other, stimuli and factors. And yet, shockingly, we still don't have really great technologies that are good at measuring many proteins at once, but that are also high throughput enough and scalable enough from a unit economic perspective to be able to deploy across a population over time or across a patient's lifetime. Most protein panels measure a small number of proteins at a time because there's some kind of, technical challenges in the space like cross-reactivity. Even companies often that claim multiplexing, you dig into their technology and you see actually that they're just kind of fractioning samples, which isn't really true multiplexing. And goes back to this, is it really solving the problem, or is it kind of a partial solution to a problem? Another factor though is the very wide dynamic range that proteins exist in your blood and plasma. And it's hard to measure those very low abundance proteins without, the noise of the very high abundance proteins, coming in and drowning it out. But there are really brilliant founders kind of working on, building technologies in the space in very creative and, anti-disciplinary ways, as we talked about before, like Range Bio. This is a company that we invested in earlier this year, where the founders developed a novel way to quantify many proteins at once and can get to incredibly high, multiplexing, cover the entire dynamic range, so everything from very low to very high abundance proteins, and at the right kind of throughput and economics that enable them to really get to scale. And the reason that this is so exciting and important is that if you're able to continually measure and remeasure the proteome across, not just a patient's entire life, but, a population, across years and decades, we open up a very interesting kind of new longitudinal lens on the understanding of proteomes, how they exist, how they evolve, how they react to things, and therefore, how to better drug them, how to better leverage and manipulate them for, improved health. So that's just one space, but many others that I'm excited about.
At some point, we're going to have you back and just do a whole hour of spaces you're excited about.
I could go for hours, yeah.
Absolutely. Maybe turning that around then, is there anything that you think might not yet be ready for prime time, but you're excited to see move forward in the future?
Yeah. One area that's really interesting, and I think we're still seeing kind of how it plays out, is longevity, which has gotten a lot of attention in recent years, both in the investment and startup ecosystem, but even a lot of kind of like news stories around longevity and what some people are doing to extend it these days. And interestingly, so the FDA, from their perspective, aging is not considered a disease. And so for many of these longevity companies, falling into that category, as they actually develop their drugs in their pipelines, they have to tie each asset to a specific disease indication, which ultimately makes them a little bit more like traditional biotech companies, but with kind of the added, excitement of the longevity term. Now, the reason I think that longevity can be very interesting in the future is because of actually a little bit of what I mentioned in the previous answer, around the importance of building technologies that enable longitudinal data sets. The more we're able to understand biology, how it evolves over time, how it reacts to things, the better that we can build solutions that do ultimately extend, both health span and lifespan. So I think we'll see a lot of interesting things in this realm over the coming decades. But I think it's one where the foundations are being built today, and we'll see kind of how they evolve in the future.
I'm similarly excited, and hopefully we can generate some human and planetary health in the meantime that keep us getting there.
Yeah.
Today, and we've touched on this a bit throughout the conversation, but it often feels like we're seeing as much innovation on the business side as the science side in the life sciences, especially around tech bio. And that innovation sometimes is almost ahead of what we might consider the commoditization of healthcare in the market. We'd love to hear how you think about, and you touched on this earlier as point 4, I believe, the go-to-market strategy and company journey for this next wave of tech bio startups. And we realize, of course, that there's not one size fits all, but your thoughts?
Yeah, there are a couple interesting things when it comes to tech bio companies in terms of how they can leverage their platforms for better or more creative, go-to-markets than I think what was, feasible before. One is the ability to jump across different customer bases, unlike, companies were able to, for example, companies that are digitizing, human data through, say, novel sensors, can perhaps, begin by, say, selling into, primary care physicians and generating revenue from that stream. But as they build and collect data, overlay AI and ML to automate diagnoses for different diseases, then that opens up, new customer bases like, pharma who may be interested in using tech, in their clinical trials. So I think it's interesting how a platform may, begin in one specific customer set, but how the success in that customer base actually allows you to expand to a new customer base. The other aspect is also how these platforms are able to capture more of the economics within the value chain that they serve. For example, here, companies that, say, build high throughput systems that generate a lot of data, whether it's experimentally or otherwise, and how we see them shift from maybe, what was a tools-based business model, more razor blade selling, tools and consumables, to actually leveraging their platforms internally to do their own, drug discovery and capture, the value of a potential asset, which, can be immense and have tons of upside. So yeah, I agree with you in that, the adoption in healthcare has traditionally been very slow paced, and that it's, very much lagging behind innovation. But I think with approaches that are enabling a lot of these, parallel business models, companies are getting more creative on how to build quickly and enter the market much sooner than they were before.
And that's something I think we're all excited by. And that's also part of the fun, I think, of working with these founders and their teams as they build these companies. How do we get to bring the technology stack forward in such a way that it enables everything else from that human to planetary health? And so as we think about the next 20, 30 years in bio and beyond, do you have any calls to action for founders or startups?
Yeah, I mean, I'm so excited about the realm. I really think that this is the decade that bio and healthcare will transform at a pace, we've never seen before and can't really imagine like before. I mean, I think in 2030 and 2040, we'll be able to cure diseases that we never thought were possible before. This will include, certain cancer indications through immuno-oncology and cell therapy. It'll also include, genetic diseases, through CRISPR and genetic medicine, going after, what has historically been an incurable disease, things like HIV. In terms of also access to care, I think we'll see healthcare hopefully in the hands of the majority of the world. This includes things like, handheld ultrasound devices in emerging regions where the cost and the expertise has been a huge barrier and a limiter to adoption in those spaces. Guided surgeries anywhere in the world that will give, access to specialized procedures where an expert might not be, present and help to, both give access and reduce complications on that side. And I think in some ways, I think we can predict what that might look like, a decade or two from now. But I think it'll also evolve in ways that we, never could have predicted, much like how I think few could have predicted, how Apple would have evolved or how Amazon would have evolved over the years. I think we'll start to be, blown away by some of the things that are happening in healthcare in the next couple of decades.
What's next on the horizon for ARTIS?
Yeah, I mean, so we're fortunate that we've been investing in this space for more than a decade now. And even in this market environment, I'd say we're just as bullish on tech bio today as we were, 10 plus years ago. So we're excited to see the foundations of the work that we began back then, how that's evolving. A lot of our companies making meaningful progress. We have companies with drugs in the clinic, which was really exciting. And, hopefully we'll see some patient lives really being impacted on the pharma side. And yeah, I mean, I'm excited to just keep partnering and, with the best and brightest founders for a very long time to come.
Well, we're hoping to do some of that partnering with you. And before we jump off, I wanted to ask a few other questions today, if that's okay. So, given in some ways what was a less traditional journey, going from life sciences into VC almost directly out of undergrad, do you have any advice for those earlier in their careers, or maybe those not in graduate programs who are seeking to get into the venture space?
Yeah, a couple things that I encourage folks to do. One is build relationships and build authentic relationships. Venture is such a mentorship business that it's really the people who want to see you succeed and those champions that will help you get through doors. I think a champion is not someone that just talks about you and promotes you when you're in the room, but really someone who has your back and promotes you when you're not even in the room. The second thing is learn by doing, which I think is a very different, approach to how science is, where you're doing research, you're planning experiments, and then you're executing them. I would say just jump in, get your hands dirty, start learning. You don't need to know everything. And I very honestly, that's where I was when I first got into venture. I was a scientist, I didn't have this background. And so I was able to fortunately learn from both the mentors I had by my side, but also just jumping in and rolling up my sleeves and getting my hands dirty.
I really love that point of just jumping in. In an entirely different direction, you've had several investments, some of which you mentioned even early on in this conversation, that have turned into acquisitions. Are there any specific characteristics of those companies that you've noticed that have led to such exits?
Yeah, I would say most of the companies, and And it's very in line with kind of what we've talked about today, but each, brought pretty interesting and disparate technological disciplines together that ultimately were able to translate into more value for customer in new ways. To go back to the example of Precision NanoSystems, I mean, they merged microfluidics and LNP formulation to enable their pharma customers to, design, manufacture, and seamlessly scale up their LNP manufacturing, into GMP levels. Ultimately, Danaher acquired them, and seeing I think because they saw the value in both the suite of tools that they were commercializing, but also this entire new realm of vaccines and drugs that are being unlocked by LNPs. So I'd say, yeah, often, disparate technologies coming together, but also I think being willing to have conviction in a space, earlier than maybe the majority of investors are willing to kind of have that risk appetite.
That's definitely a good characteristic. And as you talked about pharmas engaging, especially with early tech bio companies, do you have any advice for those pharma who might be seeking to build collaborations on how they can do so effectively?
Yeah, I think, pharma often wants to kind of wait and see until there are really robust data packages, before jumping in and partnering with companies. And then sometimes I see founders on the other side of the table also, hesitant to engage until they're really ready to hit the gas. But very honestly, I mean, I'd encourage both sides of the table to engage early, even if it's before a platform is fully baked, give feedback on from the pharma side, give feedback on what are the key needs and help shape that platform for them. That brings value not just to the startup, but to the pharma, as they're giving, kind of key feedback on what needs to be built and what solutions and what metrics need to be hit in order for this to be something that's very valuable for them.
And in an entirely different direction again, because obviously I like spinning you around in circles. I feel like we've asked a lot of professional questions. I'll ask for a lot of advice. Maybe ask something fun. What do you like to do in your free time when you're not obviously thinking about innovation and helping build the next generation of companies?
Yeah, I love being outside. I think I'm a Californian at heart, but connecting with nature, it's even therapeutic for me, not to throw a pun in there. Yeah, whether it's, hiking in jungles, scuba diving in Egypt where my family is from, AKA warm climates and warm waters. Or even actually whale watching in Monterey was something I just did recently, which was, really amazing. So yeah, just being outside and connecting with the larger world.
I'm wrapping up the scuba certification, so at some point I'll have to get your recommendations on where to go. But
Awesome. None of them are here in cold waters, but I have many other recommendations.
oh, that'll be great. In the meantime, though, any other closing thoughts, shameless plugs? How can the audience connect more with your insights, your work, ARTIS Ventures?
Yeah, I mean, I encourage folks to, please reach out, please get in touch if you're, focused on building something interesting or even just brainstorming, interesting problems across the space. Some of the investments that I ultimately made were ones where I initially met someone, there was no company formed, and we were just kind of nerding out and brainstorming on problems. So please, it's never too early to reach out. And we're excited to kind of keep guiding and investing in this space. The other shameless plug I'll make is our fellows program. I mentioned a little bit of it, but this is a program for MDs, PhDs, and postdocs, different institutions across the world. They get to spend a year with us, start learning what is venture, how does it work, and they get fully plugged into our workflow, sit in on pitches, help us with due diligence, write memos, all that sort of thing. So usually we open up those applications every spring. So do encourage anyone to apply for that.
Love the plugs, and thank you so much for the conversation today. Really enjoyed your time and your insights, Ameena, and look forward to hopefully having you back soon.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Chris. Especially, such a quality community that you've been able to build around BIOS. So it's a pleasure.